Alrighty, so this is just We the People News, okay? I'm not an attorney, not giving legal advice. Anything I say or do is just hearsay, okay? Educational purposes only. Alright, so do not take it as legal advice just in case I say something. Or this video that I'm recording. Okay? This is actually technically an interesting deal. I came across it on an accident. Knowing better. Okay, so check him out. There's that. Let's go ahead and push that. There you go. There you go. Alright. Back up. This is a Third Amendment and our officers. Let's check it out. This could be two parts, people, because this is a pretty long video. But there's a lot of clearly educational things in this 30 minutes. If you want to see the whole thing, obviously, check him out without my two parts and me talking. Let me tilt this a little bit. All right, let's proceed forward.
This channel that my views have shifted over time. The world is always changing, and so is my perspective. As part of my anniversary stream a few weeks ago, I was watching some of my older content and was somewhat embarrassed by my casual dismissal of part of the Bill of Rights.
Now to the Third Amendment. Stick with me, this one gets a little weird.
And then there's the Third Amendment, the one everyone forgets, regarding the quartering of troops. Like many people, I disregarded this amendment as a quaint relic of our distant colonial past. And like many people, I was wrong. This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream and Nebula. The soldiers are not what they seem. Much like my understanding of that show, my understanding of the Third Amendment has taken some strange turns as well. Since this amendment is often forgotten, it's worth reminding everyone of what it actually says.
No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house, without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law.
This is the Third Amendment. It comes before unreasonable search and seizure and protection from cruel and unusual punishment, so it's safe to assume that this was pretty important to colonial Americans, but why? The common answer is that in the years after the French and Indian War, British soldiers were quartered in people's homes. It's even one of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence. But there's actually very little evidence that that ever happened, certainly not on any large scale. The Quartering Acts allowed British troops to be housed in taverns, inns, alehouses, and even stables, anywhere potential revolutionaries might want to gather. So it's somewhat easy to understand why a bunch of rebellious Americans would think this is important enough to include as one of the 10 Bill of Rights, but how is this at all relevant to present day? I'll answer that question with another question. What did the police look like when the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution? I'll give you a second to think about that. Are you ready? Is it this?
The king sends 4,000 redcoats to Boston to enforce his laws.
When the Founding Fathers wrote "No soldier shall in time of peace blah blah," there was no distinction between the military and the police. Soldiers were the police and had been for centuries. Modern police forces trace their origins back to specialized military units in ancient Rome, since that's where history seems to start for everything in the West. Most famous of these were the bodyguards to emperors and generals known as praetorians, who functioned as a secret police and were heavily involved in Roman politics, even occasionally picking the next emperor. And that's pretty much how it was for most of human history. The military or some specialized guard detail kept the king's peace, but now it was supposed to be the people's peace. The first civilian police unit, created specifically to be separate from the military, was founded in London in 1829, and to distinguish them from the army, they wore blue instead of red. The idea didn't make it over to America until 1845, when the first permanent police department was established in New York. Other northern cities like Boston and Philadelphia followed a few years later. Before police departments, laws were enforced in the community by the citizens themselves. And I'm not talking about mob rule. Most every county in America had one primary law enforcement officer, the sheriff. Damn good coffee. The sheriff is another idea we borrowed from Britain, the shire reeve. It's basically the county level equivalent of a mayor. It's an elected position accountable to the people, but back in the day, it was mostly an administrative role, collecting duties and taxes. They didn't really fight crime. They delegated that to the people, either through deputizing citizens or posting bounties. Those aren't just side quests in Red Dead Redemption. That's how the law was enforced for centuries. And that was everywhere, not just the Old West. If they really needed the help, they could call up a posse of citizens or even the militia, which is why the Second Amendment exists. The Founding Fathers were against having a standing army. After a few decades, capitalism did what capitalism does, and private police agencies like the Pinkertons were formed. But as you saw in Red Dead, they were basically accountable to no one. Everything changed during the Civil War as the military was called up and used to keep the peace in the North and South, even well after the war. Once the Confederacy lost, the federal military was left in the southern states to ensure that the rights of recently freed slaves were protected, and for the most part, it worked. But Reconstruction ended in 1877 when federal troops were removed, and the Posse Comitatus Act prevented the U.S. Army from ever being used in a domestic law enforcement capacity again, except in rare circumstances. That doesn't apply to the National Guard, though, which is more accurately described as a state militia when it's under the command of a government. But we'll get back to that. Without the presence of the military in the South, there were no dedicated groups of armed white men roaming the neighborhood keeping the peace. So many cities in the South created their first police departments. At that point, many larger cities had some form of firefighting night watchmen who might handle petty crime, but mostly just caught runaway slaves, which they simply rebranded as the police. While they existed all over the country at different times, many modern-day police forces in the South can directly trace their origins to those slave patrols, which only policed slaves and hunted runaways. Unlike the elected sheriff, these new police departments were mostly unaccountable patronage positions with no training, and they had almost no effect on crime, which is an important concept which we need to spend some time thinking about. What is a crime? If I were to ask you to list
Okay, we're going to pause right there. Now, when we would actually look at the time zones of the police department and all that kind of stuff, right? It was within the realm of what? The 14th Amendment when it turned into everything corporate. Okay, so when that came around, I guess New York knew about the 14th Amendment more than any of them, because it is the first one that got police officers, because they realized that they become a corporate body. Enhances what police do. All right.
everything you would consider to be a crime, there would probably be...
Which, by the way, is the Pickermans. Back in the old days, that's what police are today, is the Pickermans.
Some obvious ones like murder and theft, but most everything else wasn't a crime 100 years ago. In 1920, the United States federal government decided that the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol was now against the law. Something that was legal in 1919 was now a crime. This was when the vague cultural concept of crime was formed, because people still wanted to do that thing that was totally fine a year ago. They're not murderers or thieves, they're just criminals. If you're at all familiar with history, this is the part where I tell you that capitalism did what capitalism does, and a black market arose to supply that demand. People still wanted to drink. This took the form of moonshiners in the woods and the mafia and organized crime in the cities. Making something illegal created criminals. Most things that we consider to be crimes are only crimes because we arbitrarily decided to make them illegal. They're consensual acts that generally have no victim. Prohibition is widely regarded as a massive failure. By labeling something consensual as a crime, they turned many previously innocent people who were minding their own business into criminals, and by extension, created organized crime.
Medicare recipients, listen up.
This is a new update about Medicare Advantage plan.
There we go. Alrighty. Uh-oh. I paused something instead of muting.
And benefits. Are you feeling stressed out by price?
Those who do
It
not
is what
learn
it
from
is.
their history are doomed to repeat it. Exactly 50 years later, Nixon declared a war on drugs as part of his law and order tough on crime initiatives, which were just a way to crack down on anti-war and civil rights protests. This is Woodstock 1969. I'm willing to bet every single person in this picture is high on something, and none of them were criminals. A year later in 1970, all of them would be labeled criminals. Those
Just put your mindset to that for a second. Once was criminals, all them people became criminals overnight. He says a year later, but when you sit and think about it, 1 minute they wasn't criminals, they signed a piece of paper, the next minute they're criminals. So it took them a total of 2 minutes with the swipe of a pen. The process took longer, obviously. But just with the swipe of a pen, 1 minute, non-criminals, next minute, criminals. Just in a couple of minutes. And if you nitpick it, within a couple of seconds.
people had a right to protest under the First Amendment, so the Nixon administration had to find something else to arrest them for, even if that meant taking something they were already doing and arbitrarily declaring it illegal. They chose drugs because, like alcohol, they were morally questionable and had the added benefit of being everywhere, crossing state and international borders. They intentionally took the weakest and most widely used drug, cannabis, and put it in the most restrictive category, because if that's illegal, nothing else can be legal. Throughout the war, they adjusted the importance of and punishment for different drugs, usually based on race. There is no pharmacological difference between powder cocaine and crack. They have the same effect on your body. The only difference is how it gets into your body, and which racial groups prefer which method of ingestion. If they're basically the same drug, you would expect that getting caught with a gram of powdered cocaine would result in the same punishment as a gram of crack, and you would be wrong. If you were caught with 5 grams of crack, you would get a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in prison. You would need 500 grams of powder cocaine to get the same sentence. White people tended to use powder cocaine, while black people tended to use crack. To help fight
And we don't think about things like that, right? Because we just always look straight forward. We never look around us to be able to protect ourselves by any means necessary. This guy right here is making absolutely, positively sense. Exact same thing, just a different usage and different method of a particular race. And yet they have different penalties over the exact same thing. Trickery of words, which is what we discussed many times over, right? They're using trickery of words.
drug war, Nixon created the Office of Drug Abuse Law Enforcement, or ODALE, a police unit with federal jurisdiction over drugs. It was one of the precursor agencies to the DEA. They began the use of heavy-handed narc strike forces to take down drug offenders in over 1,400 raids in just over a year, which averages to over 3 a day. By tying federal law enforcement funding to drug...
Even with, we'll go with narc, you get people that, what is that word? Informant, right? But you have a right to face accuser. But do you ever get the right to face the informant? Where they're the accuser. They're the witness that you have a right to question. But do you get to have your right to due process question them? No. So once you do not have that right, what did they do? Violated the due process.
policy, Nixon encouraged the states to follow suit and adopt the same laws, which they did. Before the drug war, a few states made a few drugs illegal, but now they were all illegal everywhere.
Now that you can see the forest growing, you should see the individual tree.
Rewinding a bit, during Prohibition, police departments were virtually indistinguishable from their organized crime counterparts, basically behaving like state-sanctioned street gangs. So in the 40s and 50s, there was a push to professionalize law enforcement and structure it in a similar way to the military, with squads, sergeants, lieutenants, and captains. Along with that came consolidation. All over the country, metropolitan areas combined their various community police departments into large single jurisdictions. That's why there's an NYPD rather than a Bronx or Queens PD. What this meant in practice is that police officers no longer had to live in the neighborhoods they patrolled. They could live in Brooklyn while working in Manhattan. They no longer had a stake in the community. In 1960...
And on short as well, y'all, it's a particular corporate body that they're in. Okay, basically jurisdiction, but it's the company they're working for.
A traffic stop in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles escalated to a physical altercation, and then a full-blown riot. It lasted for 6 days and only stopped when 14,000 California National Guard troops were sent in, which is how things had been done for decades. The police would handle small-scale crime, and if things escalated out of their control, they would call for the state militia's help, with varying degrees of success. But after the Watts riots, a commander in the LAPD named Daryl Gates thought that the police should have a special unit that handled civil unrest. He called it the Special Weapons Attack Team. His superiors told him that the civilian police shouldn't have something...
I hate to do this, but we need to wake up and realize during the beginning of all this, the militia was actually we the people. And well regulated was not government intervention. Okay? It was we to keep our arms and everything clean. And meetings of the minds to be efficient. Kind of like the military, but it was a we the people to protect our interests in each state. And we wasn't supposed to be regulated technically by the upper force. That happened later because they wanted control under the guides of regulation. Regulated, right? Because Congress has the right to regulate commerce. But it was commerce, not the people. But they extended this into this realm that they actually had zero authority of. Okay, not giving legal advice. I'm not an attorney, so just take it as an opinion, educational, of one man's opinion to another man.
Called an attack team and made him change it. Special Weapons and Tactics, more commonly known as SWAT teams. He had them...
We're going to pause there for part 2 because I spoke too much. Just so we the people news. Next time, bye.